Good afternoon. Today Australia is expelling 2 Russian diplomats. We're acting together with 23 other nations around the world in response to the shocking chemical warfare attack in Salisbury in the United Kingdom on the 4th of March. This was the first act of chemical warfare in Europe since the Second World War. It was a calculated attempt to carry out an assassination. It was a disgraceful assault on the sovereignty of the United Kingdom and on the rule of law, and we utterly condemn it. As the United Kingdom authorities have made clear since, this was a fundamental breach of international law, prohibiting the use of chemical weapons. Russia has an obligation under the Chemical Weapons Convention and the United Nations Charter. The fact that Russia is a member of the United Nations Security Council, the body tasked with ensuring global security, makes this breach of international law especially dangerous and shocking. It reflects a pattern of recklessness and aggression by the Russian government, including the annexation of Crimea, the invasion of the eastern Ukraine, the downing of MH17, cyber attacks, and efforts to manipulate Western nations' elections. This latest incident demanded a response and has received a concerted international response from the United Kingdom's allies and partners around the world. To do nothing would only encourage further efforts to undermine the international rules-based order upon which our security and our prosperity rely. Now, as I said when introducing new foreign interference legislation into the House of Representatives last year, Russia is threatening the democratic world right around the world. There are credible reports that Russia was actively undermining the integrity of the Brexit referendum, last year's presidential elections in France, Catalonia's unauthorised referendum in Spain, and in the United States, one of the oldest and certainly the most formidable democracy in the world. Debate is raging about whether Russian intelligence operations may have tipped the presidential election. Now, the Foreign Minister and I want to stress that Australia has no dispute with the Russian people. Indeed, today we offer our condolences for the devastating fire that has killed scores of people in a shopping centre in the Siberian city of Kemerovo. This is about the actions of the Russian government, and it's about our national security interests, which we will always defend. We cannot and will not stand by and watch when the sovereignty of our allies and partners is threatened, and that's why we're taking this strong action today. It reflects our values as a nation, respecting the rule of law, adhering to international conventions and rules-based order, and upholding our own sovereignty as well as supporting the sovereignty of our allies and partners. This type of activity is one of the key reasons why we've prioritised laws to disrupt and prosecute foreign interference and covert behaviour, and we call on the Parliament to pass these laws once they're through the current committee process. The brazen attack, the criminal attack in the United Kingdom, in Salisbury, on the 4th of March, was an attack on all of us. It was an attack on the sovereignty of every nation that respects the rule of law, and that is why we are taking this action today. With another 23 nations around the world, we are defying this recklessness, this lawlessness of Russia, and expressing in solidarity with the United Kingdom and other nations that share those values that we will not tolerate this type of reckless undermining of international law, this reckless assault on the sovereignty of nations. Julie.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Earlier this morning, the Russian ambassador was informed that I had declared 2 Russian officials persona non gratis pursuant to the Vienna Conventions on Diplomatic and Consular Relations, and that they had 7 days to leave Australia. We do not take such decisions lightly. In fact, the last time diplomats were expelled from this country was in 2012, when 2 Syrian diplomats were expelled because of the use by the Assad regime of chemical weapons. And in this instance, we share the outrage of the British government and other allies and partners over the deployment of a military-grade nerve agent in an attempted assassination in Salisbury in the United Kingdom. And we should not forget that the manner in which this nerve agent was deployed put at risk possibly hundreds of other lives. We see this as a direct challenge, a direct attack on the international rules-based system, and Australia is a staunch defender of the international rules-based system. We are also a member of the Organisation for the Prohibition Against Chemical Weapons, and we chair the Australia Group, which is a grouping of nations determined to control the export of chemical weapons. So with that background, Australia could not tolerate this act on the part of the Russians in the United Kingdom. As the Prime Minister points out, Russia is in a unique position to uphold global peace and security. As a permanent member of the Security Council, Russia has a unique responsibility to defend and strengthen and uphold the international rules-based order. Yet there has been a pattern of conduct over recent times that shows Russia is in direct defiance of that very rules-based order, with political assassinations, cyber attacks, the illegal annexation of Crimea, invasions of other countries' territory, Georgia, Ukraine, its disruptive role in the investigation into the downing of MH17 when it should be assisting the investigations. I have remained in constant communication with Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson in relation to the investigation and the ongoing actions that may well be taken in response to this matter. We will continue to support our friends and allies, particularly Great Britain, in relation to this illegal, reckless and atrocious attempt to use chemical weapons in Europe, the first attempt since the Second World War, as the Prime Minister has indicated.
Prime Minister, you've outlined a whole series of allegations and incidents of poor behaviour, unlawful acts by Russia. Is the expulsion of 2 spies a sufficiently strong reaction given the seriousness of those things you've outlined?
Well, the response obviously has been carefully calibrated, Mark, and the force of it comes from the large number of countries that are undertaking the expulsion of Russian diplomats. It's a very strong, concerted response, and it's one that sends a clear and unequivocal message to the Russians.
Russia has threatened a response, Prime Minister. What response are you expecting now from Russia? They have threatened a response. What are you now expecting?
Well, I think we expect they will expel a number of our diplomats as well. That is what they will do. I'm sure. Well, that is the response they are entitled that they will make. Well, I'll ask Julie to describe the Vienna Convention, but broadly speaking, countries have the right to declare a diplomat persona non grata if they choose to do so, and this will be the response. But the fundamental point is we are sending a clear and concerted message of 23 nations supporting the United Kingdom. That's critically important.
Given the fact that the Russians expelled 23 British diplomats in response to the British expulsion of 23 Russian diplomats, it's my expectation that Russia will likewise expel a commensurate number of diplomats from each of the countries that have taken action overnight. Also, our conversation with the Russian ambassador would lead us to believe that Russia intends to expel Australian diplomats from our embassy in Moscow. We anticipate this and we are taking contingency actions in relation to it. In other words, we are planning for this to occur, and our expectation is that, pursuant to the Vienna Convention, they will expel Australian diplomats. They're under no legal obligation to give reasons as to why.
Prime Minister.
Well, I can't comment on that.
Were they based in Canberra, and has there been any investigation about whether they've attempted to infiltrate the political process here or had contact with politicians?
It may disappoint you, but it won't surprise you to say that I'm not going to go into any further detail on the two undeclared intelligence officers, diplomats that are being expelled.
PM, are there any further sanctions being considered against Russia, and should the Socceroos boycott and other countries boycott the World Cup in Russia later this year?
Well, I'll ask the Foreign Minister to talk about the existing sanctions that we have. Look, we will continue to engage with the UK and our other partners and allies around the world in terms of the response. But it will be one that is concerted, because that's where its force comes from. You know, I pick up the point Mark Kenny made earlier. You know, asking, is this enough? The force comes for the fact that so many nations are taking the same action. So it is that solidarity that sends that very strong message to Moscow.
In relation to sanctions, Australia has already a range of autonomous sanctions against Russia, in particular those that were imposed in the aftermath of the illegal annexation of Crimea, and those sanctions have been reviewed and updated over time. So we have sanctions against a number of individuals and a number of Russian entities. The impact of sanctions, of course, is strongest when it's done collectively, and so we will continue to liaise with the Foreign Office and other allies and partners on this issue as to whether further action will be taken in response to the deployment of a chemical nerve agent in Salisbury.
Is non-attendance of the World Cup one of those possible outcomes?
There are a whole range of options of further action that could be taken. The World Cup is one of the further actions that could be taken in relation to this matter.
This is reminiscent. Sorry, this is.
Hang on.
When did the government actually find out that these two people were undeclared information officers? Was it before the UK attack?
These are intelligence matters, and we will not be going into that kind of detail.
This kind of stuff is reminiscent of the Cold War, and credible commentators are talking about a Cold War 2.0. Are those sorts of observations justified?
Well, you're the commentators. I think you can commentate on fellow commentators. It's this is a very different environment to the Cold War. There are obviously some similarities, but without getting into a discussion, which I'd love to engage in at some point with you all, but to take too long to talk about the history of the Cold War and subsequent developments. I think it is just important to, rather than getting sentimental about John le Carré novels and bygone eras, let's just focus on the very hard facts here. We have a government which has used a chemical weapon on the soil of another nation in an attempt to assassinate individuals in that other country, in the UK. Now, this is a shocking crime. It is a shocking infringement of the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. It is a shocking breach of the rule of law. And the use of a chemical weapon illegally, in contrary to international law, and for the first time, as we've both said, in Europe since the Second World War, this cried out for a concerted response. So I think we should, I don't dispute the interest in history and background and historical analogues, but let's just focus on what happened in Salisbury on the 4th of March. A shocking crime called out for a concerted global response, and Australia is playing its part in that strong response today. Now, I'll just